Larry, we're back for the second in a three-part series talking about gastroscopes that have remained contaminated, potentially exposing patients to potentially life-threatening multi-drug resistant organisms. And you all out there may have heard them called superbugs, but Larry and I have been focusing a lot in our series on these conversations. But gastroscopes is maybe under the radar, and on the last episode of this three-part series, we talked and gave an overview of what you were finding, Larry. But today we're going to drill in a little bit. You did a further analysis, and you saw maybe some connections to an air-water nozzle, which is going to be the emphasis for these last two videos, today's analysis, and then recommendations coming up in the third video. So why don't you set the table here, because we left off talking about just making the public and healthcare practitioners more aware, and what the FDA has done around communication. And I think that's a great place to start our conversation today.
So excellent. So before we proceed, I do want to point out, though, that much of my research is focusing on these adverse event reports, but I want to just make sure that the subscribers and the viewers understand that these reports can be inaccurate and incomplete. And further, that an association between an endoscope, for example, and an infection does not confirm or mean necessarily that the endoscope or the reusable device caused the infection. We typically need to have more information to draw such conclusions. So when we talked about in the first video the overview of the cases that I had been identifying linking reprocessed, and in quotes, because they're reprocessed, which means they really shouldn't have any bacteria or organisms on them, we're finding that some of them still do have organisms on them, and that can be for a number of reasons, including, for example, reprocessing staff maybe skipping inadvertently a step, but the endoscopes remaining contaminated. We don't necessarily know why. The reports don't tell us that. But while I was reading all these reports linking the gastroscopes to infections, and a few of those reports specifically to CRE or even a Candida auris, I stumbled upon a safety signal that I didn't expect to see. And that is that primarily in the April 2023, that is the reports filed or submitted to the FDA into the adverse event reporting database in April 2023, I found a safety signal that caught my attention. And what is it? And it's the contamination of the air-water nozzle of both colonoscopes and gastroscopes. So let's focus first on gastroscopes. I identified many reports describing the contamination of this nozzle. Now, what is this nozzle? At the distal end of the endoscope, this nozzle is part of the endoscope's air-water system, and it's often used to cleanse the endoscope's objective lens if it gets some debris on it. But you don't want the air-water nozzle, which the patient is exposed to during the procedure, to be contaminated, of course. It needs to be cleaned, disinfected, and devoid of any contaminants. So this was a concern that I saw with gastroscopes, what I'll call a safety signal. And then as I delved even a little bit more into this April 2023 FDA database, I identified similarly dozens of reports describing contamination of the colonoscope's air-water nozzle. So now there's more than 100 reports in the April 2023 FDA regulatory database, a medical device database, that are discussing this contamination of the gastroscope and the colonoscope's air-water nozzle. Now, none of these more than 100 reports linked the contaminated nozzle specifically to patient infection, and that's an important point. But that doesn't mean patients weren't exposed to the debris and possibly even infected. It's just were undetected. But obviously, as a rule, we can't have contamination of any endoscopes. And some of these reports discussed the foreign materials, they call it, protruding from that nozzle, seen around it, and in some cases, obvious organic debris that was on the endoscope after reprocessing, which is a safety.
So just because they don't make the direct correlation doesn't mean it's not causal. It
That's
just
exactly
means
right.
they can't prove causality in that scenario. I just want to make sure everybody's clear on that too. Just because we can't put it in the report or we can't make that determination, that's the reason for such diligence that there should be no debris at any time, because just because you find debris doesn't necessarily mean that you've made a one-to-one connection between the two.
Exactly. The concern is if you see contamination on an endoscope that you're placing into a patient, or you're finding a consistent concern as we're talking about today with focusing on the air-water nozzle being contaminated, we'll discuss in the third video how to address that and how to mitigate that risk to improve patient safety. But indeed, endoscopic surveillance or post-endoscopic infection surveillance is not done. So we don't know whether, in general, not done. We don't know whether patients are or are not infected. We just need, for full disclosure, to note that the report does not link these more than 100 cases to infections, but this still is a significant safety signal that needs to be addressed, needs to be mitigated, it needs to be discussed more, needs to be focused on, and we will do that in the third video.
Excellent. Larry, I really like this safety signals terminology. I take it that's something that you're using as a term. It's not necessarily an industry adopted one, but it really communicates, I think, the work that you're doing to mine through these adverse event reports and hey, is there a trend here? Is there something that needs to be researched further? As you were mentioning in closing there about having further discussions, which you and I will continue to do, and we'll talk about recommendations, as you mentioned, in our third and final video on this series. But absolutely, I like that terminology, safety signal. So certainly, I think we're going to be hearing us talking about safety signals and what to do about that on many of these episodes. So looking forward to video number 3, Larry, and what can people actually do about this? We've made them aware of it, but we want to give them practical application and steps to help mitigate this and to give them at least some course of action. So looking forward to that.
Right. And we'll get to that. We'll do that next video. Subscribers will find it very interesting, but I'll just say that alerting the public to these concerns is the first step to the solution.